Okay, so it's getting towards the middle of September here in the UK, and pretty soon the leaves are going to start turning orange and brown, and autumn is going to be upon us. So I decided I wanted to do a autumn scene, which will feature some of those lovely, rich, kind of warm colours that you tend to see in that as part of that season. So I'm working in Procreate as usual on the iPad. And within that app, I'm using an A4 canvas, and I'm going to be using a couple of different kinds of brushes. The main brushes that I'm going to be using is a brush called Rad. Now, really, I'm just sticking to the default kind of brushes that appear within the app. But if you wanted to go and find some sort of leaf or leaves texture, then that would do perfectly as well. Just using the ones that are actually here. I just had a root through, and in terms of being able to use what Procreate provides to you without having to go and purchase them or download them anywhere else, then I think Rad is a really good broken texture that will be applicable for kind of like, well, at a distance, it's going to look like a broken leaf-like texture when it's amongst sort of tree trunks and things like that anyway. And the other brushes I'm going to be using are mainly the soft and medium airbrush. I've got a colour palette that I've pre-chosen. The colour codes for this colour palette are going to be down in the description, and all you need to do is go onto Procreate, go to the value section of the colours, and you'll see here it has hexadecimal code section, a box where you can type in the colour. Once you type it in and press enter, then the colour should appear up there, and then you can start to piece together all the different colours that I'm going to use. You can basically see I've just got a cool colour selection and a warmer colour selection, as well as a couple of kind of browny, kind of purpley kind of colours as well. So the first thing I'm going to do on my first layer is I'm just going to create something of a background. Now I've got a very light blue colour here, and I'm going to go onto that textured brush that I was showing you before, Rad. In fact, before I do that, I'm going to stick to the airbrush actually. I'm going to go to the soft airbrush, going to turn the size of the brush up, and I'm going to put it on full opacity. I'm just going to start blocking in the bottom section here, because there's going to be no white remaining there at all. Fade it up, turn it down a bit more, fade it up, and then I'm going to put it back up. Change my brush, I'm going to go to the retro section, choose Rad, turn the size of the brush up, roughly kind of suggestions of texture here at the top section. I'm not even convinced that it's going to show up very well on camera, but it is there, and it's a subtle effect, so it won't be terribly dramatic on the final version anyway. So the next thing I'm going to do is create another layer. I'm going to turn to the next colour along. I'm going to go to my soft airbrush again, and on this colour, I'm going to, on the airbrush, I'm turning the brush really quite low down and turn the opacity of that down as well. And I'm just in the middle section going to create clusters, lines, like this. So again, this is going to be a very subtle detail. You can see when I've zoomed in here, it's not going to be something you see terribly much at all. It's only really the middle section this is going to have much of an impact on anyway. You're really not going to see this much at all. In fact, I'm not even going to bother putting it over here. And next thing I'm going to do is turn the size of the brush up, keep it on that low opacity, and I'm just generally going to start filling in this bottom section as well. And now I'm going to press really lightly as it gets towards the top. I just want to soften the impact that that's having. Again, this is all really subtle things. You're not going to see that terribly dramatically on camera, but that's the nature of what I'm creating. It really is quite subtle. So I'm going to shut down some of the light in that top corner. I'm going to gradually have it fading in over here, like that. I may as well just go over this section at the bottom as well, because there's definitely going to be no light colours there. So I'm going to create another layer. There's going to be quite a lot of layers on this particular piece. I'm going to move along to the next colour along. Now this is quite dramatically darker, really, so this should show up on camera much better. But on that basis, I'm going to turn the opacity of the brush down, and I'm really going to take a bit more care with this brush. So in fact, I'm going to change the brush to a medium brush this time. It's just a little bit too soft on the edges there. Maybe make the brush a little bit thicker than it was for the very distant trees. And I'm just going to start more carefully piecing in some trees into this scene. So these are going to be pretty distant trees, so I'm going to have the base of the tree be quite high up in this scene. When I do more foreground trees, I'm going to have the tree trunk or the tree roots be much lower down on the canvas. So one or two of these trunks I can go over a couple of times, make them jump forward a little bit more, make them a bit thicker, have other branches coming off of them as well. So they're not straight lines as such, they have a slight kind of wobble to them, slightly thicker at the bottom, the base of the trunk, but really not that much. Quite tall trees, quite slender trees. I'm going to be using some darker tones later on to really make these stand out a little bit better in some instances, but I'm just getting the general shapes in to begin with, creating a little bit of density, and then I can always go over and fine tune these later on. I just need to start building up the sense that there's layers of different sort of trees. There's some gaps maybe where you can see through, so don't overdo it. There's going to be some bits where there's kind of a blank area really. So it's this section that I want to retain to keep some of the light effects as if it's just coming through the canopy, whereas this section is going to be shut down a lot darker. So what I'll do in a moment is take this colour and just fill in some of that and just keep some of the light as if it's coming through in that section only. This is still pretty much the background kind of layers to this anyway. Okay, so I'm going to increase the size of the brush and just turn the opacity up somewhat. And I can really just bring this tone in. There's not going to be any of this blue at the bottom, but I think just by darkening that up, it really helps focus your eye on the light that's going to be in this section. So I'm just going to, just for the perception that it gives, I'm just going to shut down this area a little bit more as well. And then I'm pressing very lightly as I bring it further up. Maybe bring it up into this section a little bit, pressing very lightly. It's almost like there's a blue mist coming into this bit, and then as it gets onto this section, I'm much happier to shut all of that down, like so. Okay, so the only really effect that I've created so far is just the sense that there's more light coming through in this area. So I'm going to create another layer. I'm going to move along to the next colour blue, turn the brush down, and I'm going to create some trees now that are much more in the kind of middle distance. Now, looking at that blue that I've actually pre-selected, it seems a little bit too vibrant for now. I think what I might do is skip that one and move along to another one that's a little bit duller. Sometimes that happens, you have a preconception about what the colours are going to work and what don't, but I'm just going to actually skip that one. Now I'm going to move further down into the scene, so these trees are going to just start a little bit nearer to, well, what would be you, the viewer, I guess, if you were in this scene. So if you're going to have branches shooting off from the main trunk, they're going to have to be more narrow than the trunk itself. And obviously the trunk is going to get slightly narrower as it goes up as well. So another technique you can use if once you've created a few is that you can duplicate the layer. Take what you've created, flip it horizontally, and you can always move it to another section. Saves a little bit of time if really what you're looking to create is the effect and you don't want to spend too long on that. Just need to be careful you don't create too much of a sense of symmetry, otherwise it's going to give away exactly what you've done there really. But either way, it saves you a little bit of time. By the time you've added a few more in there, you really will lose the sense of any symmetry that you may have inadvertently created in that scene. Make the base of these ones a little bit thicker. Okay, I'm going to create another layer, and now I'm going to move along to really a darker colour blue for this one. And these are going to be much more obviously foreground trees. So I'm going to bring them further into the piece. They're going to be darker, they're going to interfere, go over the top of the more distant ones. I'm just going to spend a little bit more time fine-tuning the shape of these ones as well. So make them a little bit thicker. They're obviously darker because of the darker colour I'm using. Bottom of the trees comes further down into the scene. Perhaps spend a little bit more time creating some branches that kick off from these. You're going to get more of the details more visible. Making these more substantial looking, thicker. Also, it's more foreground, you might have a slightly bigger gap between the trees as well, So you don't need to do quite as many of the real foreground larger trees. I'll come back to these different layers and I will fine tune them, but I'm just going to move on to the next layer now. So I'm really getting to the darker elements now. So these are going to be trees that are really foreground. They're really going to dominate the landscape much more. So bring them down to this kind of area. I guess you just need to be selective. You don't want to cover up something that you feel is quite nice and working well in your scene. So maybe I'll do it more here. Maybe we have another tree here. Maybe that angle's a bit too much. Delete that, start that one again. Again, I'm going to fine tune the shape of this a little later on. Just trying to get the basics, the framework of the piece in. Maybe have a tree here. So now we're starting to get something of a sense of distance and depth perception now, mainly because of the atmospheric kind of effect of things looking more distant. So now that I've got these layers in, I feel like I want to go back and adjust one or two. And there's different ways that you can achieve different effects. You can go straight in with the colours, but this is digital painting, so you can go back and affect it in different ways too. So I've got this layers here. I've got the very background layer that I didn't do very much to. It was very subtle. And then I've got the layer above that, which was the first suggestion of sort of trees. I'm going to take that first layer. I'm going to go onto my brightness, hue, saturation and brightness, and just turn the brightness down, darkening up that effect. And I'm going to go do the same to that one. I'm going to darken up all these layers, shutting down the amount of light that I've actually created. And you can really play around with the balance of these to get the effects looking exactly as you want. I'm going to turn the saturation down on that one a little bit as well. Next layer, I'm going to change the brightness, and then the very top layer, again, I'm going to turn the brightness down on this one so it really becomes quite dark. Like I say, there's very different ways that you can achieve effects, and that's just another one at your disposal when you're working digitally. So I'm going to create another layer between layers 2 and 3, and I want this layer to start adding some of the leaves, some of the stuff that you'll find on the kind of forest floor. So it might seem strange at first, but I'm going to go to my most yellow colour, and I'm going to change my brush to the Rad brush within the retro brushes, and I'm going to turn the opacity of this brush down, check the size of the brush. I'm going to vary it a little bit anyway, but I'm just going to start picking out some colours in the distance here. So I'm beginning to bring in a suggestion that there's actually some distant kind of yellowy colours going off in the background there. So you don't need to worry too much about going over the other trees because they're all on a more forward layer anyway, so that isn't really a problem. So I can turn the opacity way up actually for this. I can just start to bring in some patchiness. Maybe turn the size of that brush up as we get slightly more further forward. It's quite a subtle effect, this. It certainly is in person. It might, if anything, it looks slightly more exaggerated on camera than it does in person. But we're just bringing in some of that yellow effect. It's quite broken, like that. Now I'm going to create another layer, but this time I'm going to put it between layers 3 and 4. And I'm probably going to move it along and pick a slightly more orangey colour. Turn the opacity down for this because it's going to be quite potent really. Turn the size of the brush down too, and I'm just now going to begin placing in some of this. Again, I don't need to be too precious about where I put these. I can go in front of most of the branches. In fact, I'll turn the size of the brush up. See, I'm not doing it in straight lines. I'm just sort of keeping it a kind of round motion, moving it to left or left to right, but I'm keeping this kind of scribbling effect almost. It's going to be much more in the way of colours at this end anyway, but I'm going to move along to one of my other oranges because you're going to have a variety of different tones here. It's not going to be one type of orange or yellow. It's going to be layers of different types. So you can really start to build this up a little bit. So some of that blue is going to begin disappearing down here. You're not going to see any of this blue by the end. In fact, one thing that I think would be really useful for this at this stage is to create another layer, put it underneath that layer that I've just created, go to my other colours, go to the bottom colour down here, and I've got a kind of reddy brown. And what I'm going to do with my soft airbrush is I'm going to turn the size of the brush up, turn the opacity up, and I'm going to place this underneath here. Now it's going to seem too extreme initially, but it's just going to begin revealing some of the colours that are there. So we really want to fade it out at this point, really. Don't want that dark colour on the floor to extend more or further back than about here. Now instantly that's kind of revealed some of these tree trunks that are not looking right now because they're not dark enough. So these ones certainly now need to be a little bit darker, and you can just check all the different layers you've got. Those ones need to be a little bit darker too. Okay, so I'm going to go between layer 4 and 5, create another layer, and I'm going to go to some other colours that I've got here. So I've got a real red brown colour, go back to my retro, try the rad brush again. So you just need to be a bit more selective in the way that you use this now. I mean, if I wanted to go back and use this darkest colour, I could start to break up that and create patches and gaps in there too. It's not all going to be adding reds and oranges and yellows. It might be adding gaps between it as well. Now, I'm not for any moment suggesting this is the best kind of texture brush. It might be that you've managed to download one and that will be better for the task. I'm just using it as an example of the kind of texture brush that you can use. It's not something I use very often anyway, but for something where there's maybe thousands of kind of leaves and points of individual texture and forms, I think that to do it all manually, although possible, you know, it's going to take you a long time, and maybe the best route to it might be to create something that's more impressionistic in actual fact. But we're using a texture brush in this case. Okay, I'm going to stay on this layer. I'm going to go to my yellow colour again. I'm going to turn the opacity way down for this, maybe the size of the brush down as well. And I'm just going to be a little bit more precise with this kind of texture. So like I said, you could do all of this manually anyway, but I'm just going to use the combination of the texture that's provided by the brush and a little bit of doing it manually too. So by turning the size of the brush down and spending the time by going over and over it, you've really got the best of both worlds there. So I'm going to push some of these colours back, shut down some of the blue that's perhaps still showing through on the floor. So maybe there's light coming through in this scene. Maybe some bits are receiving more light through and that's why we're getting more yellow. Could be a combination of the light and the actual leaves themselves, the different colours. I'm going to go back to my more orangey colours too. So I've got a full range of different oranges here. I'm going to turn the intensity of that up a little bit. I'm just going to start bringing that in to work in conjunction with the yellow. So just breaking up any sense that the actual brush that I've used in the bigger setting, because I was using it like this, it's created the sense perhaps that there's some patterns, it looks a bit artificial. So I'm going back in now with a much smaller version of the same brush and just sort of scribbling in, breaking up some of that, you know, more angular looking shapes, trying to make it look a little bit more organic again. It is quite impressionistic, this particular style of piece. Okay, I'm going to move along to some of these redder colours, so maybe the third one in there. Again, really at this point, I'm just starting to build up the different kind of colours and different effects. So there's no particular order that's necessary for this. This is what I'm doing right now. But you ever play around with this, that's the beauty of having digital format. You can try things out and if it goes wrong, you can correct it, undo it. I think I want to start shutting down some more of the light in this area. That was the original intention. It feels like it's still too light in that area. So I'm going to go back through the layers and I'm going to use this colour. So it's the third one along. It's quite a dark colour. I'm just going to turn the opacity of it down and I'm going to use a soft airbrush and I'm just going to start using it to shut down some more of those areas. So I'm going to go through the different layers in order to do that. So any layer that's got trees on it, I'm going to start doing that. Maybe a little bit on this side as well. Okay, I'm going to go to my top layer here. I feel that the trees in this particular one, again, it needs to just be that little bit darker just to make them jump forward a little bit more. That seems to work a little bit better. Now what I'm going to start doing is I'm going to start adding some leaves into the top area of the trees. So the first layer I'm going to start doing that too is going to be this layer. So it's not the very front layer, it's a slightly further back one. I'm going to use some of the earlier colours I was using. I'm going to use the Rad airbrush, the Rad brush again. I'm going to turn the size of the Rad brush up a little bit and the opacity down a little bit. So again, just remind yourself where those particular trees are, and I'm going to start trying to add them to those particular forms. So in this middle section, it's probably going to catch the light a little bit more too. Anything that's off towards the peripheral, I'm going to maybe just stick with more orangey kind of colours. But back here, I'm just going to get the suggestion that there's maybe some yellow. It can cut in front of the tree here as well. Okay, I'm going to switch to the more kind of orangey colours here. I'm going to start feeding these in as well, turn the opacity up somewhat. I want this to be quite vibrant. I'm going to create another layer, put it at the very top because I want this to sort of be cutting in front of all the other things. I'm going to have a real nice orangey colour here. I'm going to have this feeding in front of everything else, turn the opacity up. Maybe use a couple of the lighter oranges intermingle with it as well. I feel like I'm actually going to take that yellow and just make it a little bit whiter as well. Maybe in this sort of central area. Maybe the leaves are catching the light a little bit more. Okay, I'm working on the top layer now. I'm just going to use some of these colours like the yellow and just really start to add it into areas perhaps where I think I need to exaggerate that colour a little bit. So I've got colours down here as well. I'm going to start adding a little bit of these other colours, just bring a suggestion of them in. I think if you create a piece like this and it's all a bit too monochrome or just two colours, basically it can look a bit boring. So sometimes just by adding just a slightly more kind of random element in there or something just to add a bit of variation like this can make it more interesting. So some of that kind of slightly maroony purple colour almost just in the mix can make it a little bit more interesting. Okay, so I'm going to go to my second darkest colour that I use for the trees and the sky kind of area. I'm on the soft airbrush and I'm just going to use this now just to settle the trees into exactly where I want them. If there's any trees that don't quite sit right, if they look like they're too light now in the scene, I can go over them, make them a little bit darker, can add some finer branches coming off them, can really push them around, push some forward, push some back, and just have a play around a little bit. Can also make some of the tree trunks blend into the scene a bit better, maybe add some roots that are emerging through the leaves. Feed some smaller kind of details through perhaps. You get a small tree emerging there. Maybe it ties these different bits of branches together somewhat, or the leaves rather. So I'm using this dark colour now just to maybe create some gaps in the leaves. So it's partly a suggestion of root structures maybe that are poking out, but also there's going to be areas where perhaps the actual leaves separate and you see more of the kind of patchy ground, the soil showing through as well. So whenever something looks like totally one thing, it can look a bit boring, so break it up a little bit, create contrasts. So just like you've got the contrast of tone here, if you've got like a large area of flat texture or very similar textures, maybe you need to go in there and break it up a little bit just to make a more interesting scene. Maybe I can have another tree that's coming in from the outside here, and some of the roots are just starting to emerge into the scene there. So although that I've tried to create a system perhaps where it creates a little bit of depth in there, sometimes you really have to go in there and fine tune the tones to actually place things in the kind of distance that you want them to be. So I can go back in and pick out some of these trees perhaps. There's maybe a faint suggestion of them already, but I just want to make them a little bit clearer, make them more of a feature than perhaps they have been up until now. I may be going over some of these yellow sections with this blue. It can really create the sense that there is a kind of heavy atmosphere, mist that's coming in there and knocking some of that yellow back a little bit, which could be really an effective look. I'm going to go back to my orange, or maybe I'll just stick to the soft airbrush and start to apply some texturing more manually as well. I do like to do that. I do actually find the more manual application of texture and highlights and elements like this more satisfying doing it by hand. I think that it's all very well and good using textural brushes, but somehow you lose that sense of connection to what you've actually created in some cases. So I just like to go back in and maybe feel I have more of a control over those elements. I'm going to use the third colour in here, and I'm just going to use that now just to create a slight sense of highlight or texture onto the edge of the tree. I'm really not going to spend a long time doing that. A tiny suggestion of it here and there actually goes a long way. So maybe just along one edge, I'm just going to create some slightly broken markings here, but really not a lot is required. Okay, I could definitely fine tune this for hours, but I think in terms of creating the overall effect, then I'm going to leave that there for now. If you want to go over and support me over at Patreon to get access to things like downloadable colour palettes for tutorials like this, there is a link down in the description for that. Otherwise, don't forget to subscribe before you leave, and I shall catch you back here again. See you later.